Okay, I wanted to talk through just a couple of other examples. These are representative of several of the late capitalism posters. This is Team 5's submission, and I actually thought their definition of late capitalism was the best that I looked at carefully. So good job, Team 5. They got one vote, probably for that. All their examples are top notch too. I wanted to point out some issues regarding the policy response, and these issues pertain to what the government can and cannot do. So raising wages while still curbing the rate of inflation. So first off, the government doesn't set wages in the economy. So, that's an important thing to keep in mind. And second, the government doesn't get to say there shall be no inflation. If the government does something that puts inflationary pressure out there, that's going to happen. The government can't stop it by decree or by law. Anyway, as far as wages, the government can increase minimum wages, minimum wage laws. That's a reasonable policy suggestion, maybe. But even there, in an environment where, to be employed, an employer would have to be willing to pay the worker the minimum wage, and excuse me, the employer wouldn't hire a worker that if that minimum wage were higher than the value that employee brings to the company in general. Anyway, so raising a minimum wage very high runs the risk of creating a lot of unemployment. So, minimum wage laws are pretty tricky and pretty dangerous for that reason once you get them into very high wage territory anyway, say 15, 20 bucks an hour, as there is political pressure to move them. There are other things the government can do. Reduce payroll taxes. That's the Social Security Medicare tax that's applied to the first $100,000 of income. Expand that tax base to maybe the first $200,000 or $300,000 of income. There's ways to take some of the burden off the poor households, increasing their take-home pay, that are within the government's policy purview. But just dictating wages, hey, you're an engineer, you should make $100,000 a year. The government doesn't do that. Those are labor markets making those decisions, and we'll talk about that over the course of the semester. But it's very important to develop a sense of what kinds of things the government can and cannot do. Again, here, the create more quality paying jobs. Well, sometimes the government, notably in the Great Depression, the government has created work programs. They're not very high paid, but remember the economy was beset with huge unemployment and persistent unemployment in the Great Depression. So the U.S. government employed millions of people in the CCC, the Citizen Conservation Corps. I might be lousing up one of those C's, and all sorts of other government programs. Again, not high wage, but the government can't just say, hey, you, Ford Motor Company, create a bunch of jobs. It's just not what the government can do in a free capitalist economy. And once we've seen Soviet Union, China before 1970s, 80s, reforms, Albania, Cuba. We've seen governments try to do that kind of thing, and it's been a pretty big disaster every time, at least in the disaster in the sense of suppressing economic growth on a per capita income basis, and by many other measures too. And then also laws that don't allow pets before others. What do you mean? How do you legislate that? Again, that's a pretty tough one. We can, since the example is boarding planes, is have a law that requires documentation of service animals credentials before you allow them on the plane, and disallow things like peacocks and other birds that are really intrusive to other people's space. Sorry, if you can't travel without your peacock, take the bus or the train or drive yourself. But anyway, so you can do that, but But laws that don't allow pets before that's a really tough one. What if a rich person wants to feed their dog filet mignon? Is that against the law? How do you enforce that? I mean, you gotta think about feasibility and what the scope of allowed government action is in a free society. Anyway, I wanted to mention that. We'll spend much of the semester on those questions. Just a word also on Team 6's poster. I actually really like this poster. The definition I wasn't too keen on, but I like the grid and the very neat writing, and so a lot to like about this. One thing I wanted to mention that came up in a lot of posters: increased regulation of production in markets. If a certain article of clothing exists or costs X to make, it can only cost a certain percentage above that. That sounds sort of seductive, and I can see the appeal of such policies. One of the things we're going to learn this semester is that putting price ceilings or price floors on markets, that when the government intervenes to change the signal that markets offer, that's the government is going to end up unintentionally usually and not understood by most people in the economy. The government is often severely changing or dramatically changing the signals that members of the economy use to either pull resources out of a sector or that attract resources to a sector. So if there are huge returns to a certain sector, that sector is going to attract entry and more production, and that's going to drive down prices. But if the government says, no, you can't do that, well, then resources aren't going to go there, and those prices aren't going to be driven down by competition, and oftentimes there's other outlets for the once you reduce competition, there could be other abuses of consumers. So I'd caution against jumping at a price ceiling. That's what we call this, where the government limits prices. That's a real problematic policy. Back to the Team 2's recommendation, I think a lot of these income inequality problems that's the better definitions of late capitalism emphasize those. The policy recommendations of increase the base quality of education for all citizens. If you're highly educated, you generally have high earning power and low unemployment. It's a real long-term solution, but it's a really good strategy in the long run. Other than that, increasing the progressivity of the tax code is a plausible argument. Krugman, actually, he's known as a liberal economist. I don't know that he's that liberal. He's pretty middle of the road on a lot of things, but he argues that the European social democracies do a lot better at creating a safety net that limits the misery at the low end of your income distribution without dampening the incentive to work. If you're poor and somebody gives you $40,000 just to get your level of living up, and that's what you feel you need to live, well, why would you work? So Krugman says, hey, don't enact that kind of policy, but instead, or actually the earned income tax credit is a different sort of policy that's tied to work. That's actually a reasonable policy solution that I didn't mention before. But anyway, Krugman's argument is, look, the public sector should fund education. We'll talk about the argument in favor of that kind of thinking because there's so many positive externalities of a highly educated individual for society. But publicly funded education, publicly funded healthcare, publicly funded parks and other amenities. This raises the level of living whether you make a lot of money or don't, without discouraging people from working, those are reasonable policy suggestions if you want to address directly the problem of income inequality. And anyway, those are what's not reasonable, for reasons we'll talk about, is governments that set a lot of price ceilings and price floors end up creating a lot of harm and creating a lot of unintended consequences that to a large measure cancel out any good that those policies do. So that's going to be a central lesson of the course. Watch out for that.